Let us imagine a meadow in a forest. It has lots of grass and blackberry brambles to hide in. It's a wonderful place for a rabbit to live in and raise a family. And so we have a family of rabbits that live there, a village of families of rabbits even. They live in this meadow. There's enough food for the rabbit family, and so it grows, and the neighbor's family grows, and we begin to wonder how big the rabbit families can grow to be. There is only so much room and so much space to go around. Eventually, there will not be enough food to go around, and the new rabbits will either have to move and find new meadows to live in and raise families, or they will starve and perish. This is called carrying capacity. Um, Only so many of a given species can live in a certain place. Too many rabbits will eat all of the food and knock the balance out of whack. And everything is all about that balance, right? If you knock one part out of balance, another part will fall out of balance. So let's quickly learn how a population can grow and find that balance. If we take a look at this graph, we can see the bunny population and how it grows over time. This straight line means that the further along we move in time, the more bunnies there are. And this would grow forever. The further you go on in time, the more bunnies you get. Another way that your bunny population could grow is this shape. This is called a logarithmic growth. From no bunnies, you have a lot of bunnies that show up, and then this curve means it's slower and slower. You're getting fewer and fewer bunnies over time. Right? So the further on you go in time, the number doesn't keep growing, it just stays level. Right? A lot of bunnies quickly, and then not very many bunnies, additional bunnies, moving forward. Kind of the opposite shape of that is this. This is called exponential. You start with not very many bunnies, it's growing slowly and slowly and slowly, and then all of a sudden you have a huge explosion in the number of bunnies. So for a long time, very few bunnies, and then once you have enough bunnies, huge jump up in the number of bunnies. But in the real world, we tend to see something that looks like this. This is called an oscillation. And you can see, the number of bunnies is growing up, and then it reaches a certain point, and the number goes down. Okay, and then it reaches a low point, and the number goes up. Maybe this is a big difference, maybe this is a little difference, but we see this sort of thing where you have growth, and then you have fewer. And you have growth, and then you have fewer. Right? We talked a little bit about, or I mentioned something called carrying capacity. You don't have more than this many bunnies because maybe there's not enough room, or maybe there's not enough food, right? And then some of the bunnies will move away or pass on. But along with this, we often see a curve that also looks like this. Right? If the blue curve is our bunny population, you can see as it goes up, this one goes up a little bit later, and then as it goes down, this one goes down a little bit later. And then once this one goes down, this one starts to go back up. So we can see as the bunny population goes up, this little curve goes up, and then it reaches the carrying capacity of this one, and the bunny population is going down. Then once we reach a low point, the bunny population goes back up. And that's because this bunny population is being trailed by a predator population, maybe coyotes. So the more bunnies there are, the more coyotes there can be. But once there's enough coyotes that they're eating lots of bunnies, that population goes down. But once it goes down, the coyotes go down because there's not enough bunnies for them to eat. But once the population of coyotes goes down, the bunnies can go back up, right? And so they're connected. If you got rid of all of the coyotes, the bunny population would shoot way up. If you got rid of all of the bunnies, the coyote population would shoot right down. So these are connected. Okay? They are periodic or cyclical and connected. All populations of animals are subject to this type of cycle. Currently, we are living through the emergent stage of one of the most interesting creatures out there. I, of course, am talking about the periodic cicada. Every year, we see and hear cicadas. Most of the time, they are from a group of insects called Neotabicen, or the dog day cicadas. We see these cicadas every year, even though their life cycle is 2 to 5 years depending on species. They are called dog day cicadas because they appear around when Sirius, the dog star, rises just before the sun. This is around late July, and it's usually the hottest and muggiest time of year. So if you ever hear about dog days or dog days of summer, that's what it means. It's those very hot, muggy, late summer days. Periodic cicadas are related, but they have a much longer life cycle. Most of the periodic cicadas have a 17-year life cycle. Some of them, however, have a 13-year life cycle. Okay, that's a super long time. Okay, let's learn a little bit about the periodic cicada and why they might have such a long life cycle. One early researcher that is also important to the history of Washington, D.C. is a man named Benjamin Banneker. Mr. Banneker was involved in the original mapping of the boundary that became Washington, D.C. So that diamond shape that is Washington, D.C., he helped to map all of that. Right? And one of the reasons he was useful in that is he had a lot of astronomical knowledge. So he could figure out where exactly they were on the planet or around Washington, D.C., so they could map these straight-lined edges that became Washington, D.C. He was a self-taught natural historian who became well known for those astronomical observations and calculations. Using this knowledge, he published a number of almanacs throughout his life. An almanac is basically a collection of essays around an annual calendar, not always having to do with sometimes the political or natural history, but the core of an almanac is an annual calendar containing important dates and statistical information such as astronomical data, you know, full moons, eclipses, that sort of thing, as well as tide tables, so you could know when the tide was rising and falling, because that, of course, is related to the moon. Mr. Banneker also became a correspondent of Thomas Jefferson, who deeply respected him and his accomplishments. Mr. Banneker accomplished all of this while being a self-taught scientist and while being a free black man during a time that was unfortunately not the most common thing. Because of his race, not everyone respected him or his accomplishments as they might otherwise. In fact, Mr. Banneker was one of the first American naturalists to write about the periodic cicada. Specifically, he wrote about Brood X because he was from this area. He was from kind of the Ellicott City area. And Brood X was the brood of cicadas that emerged around him. And they're the brood that is emerging this year in 2021. In 1732, when they emerged, Mr. Banneker was newly born and he was a baby. He saw the first emergence he was aware of in 1749, and he repeatedly observed the cicada in 1766, 1783, and finally in the year 1800. Here is a quote. "The first great locust year that I can remember was 1749. I was then about 17 years of age, when thousands of them came and were creeping up the trees and bushes. I then imagined they came to eat and destroy the fruit of the earth, and would occasion a famine in the land. I therefore began to kill and destroy them, but soon saw that my labor was in vain, and therefore gave over my pretension. Again in the year 1766, which is 17 years after their first appearance, they made a second, and appeared to me to be full as numerous as the first. I then, being about 34 years of age, had more sense than to endeavor to destroy them, knowing they were not so pernicious to the fruit of the earth as I imagined they would be. Again, in the year 1783, which was 17 years since their second appearance to me, they made their third, and they may be expected again in the year 1800, which is 17 years since their third appearance to me, so that, if I may venture to express it, their periodical return is 17 years. But they, like the comets, make but a short stay with us. The female has a sting in her tail as sharp and hard as a thorn, with which she perforates the branches of the trees, and in holes she lays eggs. The branch soon dies and falls, then the egg, by some occult cause, emerges a great depth into the earth, and there continues for the space of 17 years, as aforesaid. I like to I like to forget to inform that if their lives are short, they are merry. They begin to sing or make noise from the first they come out of the earth till they die. Their hindermost parts rot off, and it does not appear to be any pain to them, for they still continue singing on till they die. The most amazing part of that quote to me is that it's so correct. These days we have things like Cicada Safari, which is an app on your iOS or Android phone. Um, Using that, any of us, thousands of us across the country, can observe, record, and upload our observations to a database, to Cicada Safari. Experts then review that information and will verify it. Helps them to study where Brood X is emerging and when. Gives them a lot of data to analyze and to study. Mr. Banneker had none of that. He had his eyes. He observed them for a month and a half that they were around, 3 times, and then wrote that passage. Okay, for the intervening 17 years, he could talk with other naturalists who had observed it, but that was it. Okay, everything he said about their life cycle is correct. All right, so let's take a look at the periodic cicada's life using Benjamin Banneker's words. He said, the first great locust year that I can remember was 1749. Cicadas and locusts both are insects, but cicadas are not locusts, and locusts are not cicadas. We find this sort of thing often in the naming of things. The first Europeans to encounter cicadas likened the huge numbers of them that showed up to their stories of the locust, and thus they gave the cicadas the same name, locust, but they're not the same. Locusts are a type of grasshopper, and they exhibit a behavior called swarming, where locusts from all over the region will come together and gather in a large swarm. There might be millions or even billions of locusts in the swarm, and the swarm sweeps across the land and eats everything in its path. Um, this, as you can imagine, was devastating for agricultural communities. If you have a big field of wheat that is supposed to keep you alive, and the locusts come by and eat it all, that causes hardship, right? Um, and so Western culture has preserved stories of locusts destroying our crops, okay? But cicadas do not swarm. Cicadas are not locusts. Okay, where you find cicadas is where they emerged. They emerge in huge numbers, and it might feel like a swarm, but the behavior is different because cicadas aren't constantly eating everything. Cicadas just emerge to do what they do, and then they die and go away. All right, they do not eat everything in their path. All right, Mr. Banneker said, so that if I may venture to express it, their periodical return is 17 years, but they, like the comets, make but a short stay with us. This is true. Um, One needs to observe and keep records or stories of cicadas over decades to see this pattern, right? Figuring out why this pattern exists is part of a larger story, but Mr. Banneker lived long enough and had good enough observation skills that he was able to see the 7-year cycle occur, right? This type of knowledge is kept in traditional stories. These days, we keep it in our scientific journals and on the internet. Right? That's where we store our stories these days. Right? But you have to see it multiple times. If you see something and then 17 years later it happens, that's not a story yet. If another 17 years it happens, now you're getting a trend, and then another 17 years, you can see that cycle, right? Mr. Banneker said, "This is true." Uh, Mr. Banneker said, "The female has a sting in her tail as sharp and hard as a thorn, with which she perforates the branches of the trees, and in the holes she lays eggs. The only reason that a cicada emerges from the ground is to find a mate and to lay eggs so that another generation can be born to carry on the line of cicadas. While underground, the cicadas are in a form called the nymph. Okay, they don't look as formed; they just look a bit creepy crawly. They crawl through the earth, digging holes, and feed on the juices of tree roots. Once the cicada emerges from the earth, they climb up a plant. Their nymph form splits open. The adult pops out of the shell of the nymph, and the adult cicada emerges. When it emerges, because it's been stuffed in that nymph shell, it's soft and it's vulnerable. This is when lots of birds and other animals love to eat them, right? And it's kind of white and hasn't developed its colors. That's how you know it just emerged, when you see them white. It's got to pump fluid throughout its body, kind of like swelling of a hose, open up its wings, let them dry and harden so that they can fly, and then it will fly off and seek a mate and seek to lay its eggs. Mr. Banneker said, "I like to forget to inform that if their lives are short, they are merry. They begin to sing or make a noise from the first they come out of the earth till they die. Once they are fully dried, their wings are fully dried and they can support them, the males fly off to find a good high space to perch and begin to sing a song to find a female, to find a someone to have offspring with. Only the males make noise, the females don't. So the males have a special organ called a tympani, which is it's kind of like a big old air sac that they use to make their sounds. Once the female finds a male she likes, she will then go to a tree branch that is about the size of a pencil. She uses a special body part that she has called an ovipositor, or an egg egg placer to cut a hole in the branch, and she deposits her eggs inside of it. Okay, that job done, the adult cicadas fall back down to the earth and die. If you see trees wrapped up, I'll show you some in my garden. That is because those are generally younger trees that have limbs of the correct size, and we are trying to keep that damage from happening to the young trees. Older trees can survive. In fact, the cicada damage may actually help them to prune and set more fruit next year. Mr. Banneker said, then the egg by some occult cause emerges to a great depth in the earth, and there continues for the space of 17 years, as aforesaid. Mr. Banneker did not have access to the same sorts of cameras and lenses that we do, so he would not have been able to see the next steps as well as we can. If he misses the hatching, it will not happen for another 17 years. All right. We now know that other broods hatch each year. Every year there is a brood of periodic cicadas that hatches somewhere, but he would not. You won't see them hatch in the same spot for another 17 years. So if you miss it, it's gone. After a few weeks, the tiny baby cicada hatch and fall from the branch to the earth. They'll burrow under the ground and stay there for the next 17 years. And the cycle starts anew. Mr. Banneker said, the hindermost part rots off, and it does not appear to be any pain for them, for they still continue on singing till they die. This is the most interesting part to me of his quotes. It shows that he truly was looking closely and observing at what is actually happening to the cicadas during their brief time above ground. A common sight towards the end of their emergence period is the adults have white spots or their abdomen turns white. This is a fungus that infects the adult cicadas and it eats away at their abdomens, but it doesn't seem to bother them. Their lives are so short, their focus is so specifically on having the next generation that even being infected with a fungus doesn't cause them to deviate from their mission. All right, and Mr. Banneker saw that, observed it. He may not have known why, but still amazing he was able to draw all of these correct conclusions about the lifestyle of cicadas just by observing them 4 times. So as an aside, I wanted to show you guys a quick video about some origami cicadas. I know a lot of you have or were shown how to make an origami cicada in art, and I'm going to do 2 things. One, I'm going to share um, that same plan so you guys have it. And if you don't have it at all, you can keep practicing that one. But what I want to show you is a clip from a longer YouTube video of this master origami maker who makes that origami that you learned, which is a very fundamentally basic version, and he makes 11 total more complicated ones. So level 1 is the one you guys learned, and he makes level 11. And what I find interesting about this is kind of how nature has to do things, right? You take a flat piece of paper, and just by folding it and shaping it in different ways, you can get really complex body shapes like an insect, like a cicada. And so the level 11 version of this cicada origami, or Origami Cicada, is very realistic working, very realistic looking, because that's fundamentally how they're formed. Is as they're developing, there's information inside our DNA that tells our body what to grow when, and that's just like the plan he has, where he is deciding where to fold and how to fold, and then it's just a process of doing that pattern, and you get a complex shape like a cicada out of a flat piece of paper. So just check these videos out. Like I said, I'll share the plan and the link to this whole 11-step YouTube video for you guys to see. But I just wanted you to see the difference between the fewest amount of folds that makes what's still obviously a cicada, and something very complex that still comes from the same basic idea. The more folds, the more complex it gets, but it's just folding pieces of paper.
My level 1 would be the traditional Japanese cicada, because it's one of the simplest folds in all of origami. It's just a handful, maybe 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 steps, all simple folds. And yet, it reads very strongly as a cicada. This can be folded by almost anyone in just a few minutes. It consists of nothing but valley folds, the simplest fold in all of origami. Although it only has a handful of folds, there's a few places where you can put your personal stamp on it by making judgment folds, folds that don't have a specific reference point. In particular, the angle at which you fold down the wings, and then the angles at which you fold down these two corners on the top, are done pretty much by eye. By adjusting those folds positions, a person can adjust the character and the finished shape of their cicada. My level 11 design is a cicada. We're back to the classic pose, but this deceptively simple design actually has the most complex folds of everything we've done before. Just in terms of the design, this is actually a step backward in complexity because it's just an array of bird bases. But in terms of the complexity of actually folding, this is the most complex of anything that we've looked at. It contains closed sinks, mixed wraps, combinations of all these folds, and a very large number of them. So many individual folds. Those middle points require much more complex folds than any of the steps that we've done leading up to this. And that's what makes this the highest level